So I'd like to welcome everyone to the North America Climate Justice Team's March Climate Colloquy. Our guest today will share his insights on how climate issues affect global stability and security. But first, we have a few housekeeping announcements. The first is that we will not have a webinar in April due to World Conference. And we'll be, the Climate Justice Team will be participating in several events at World Conference, and we invite you to come by and see us. We'll be in two different lunch and learn sessions, one on Tuesday, which is going to be with the Earth Stewardship Team. And we have another lunch and learn on Thursday that is put on just by the our Climate Justice Team. If you happen to be a young adult, an actual young adult, not just if you know one, but young adult and youth, lunch on Wednesday that we're also participating in. And we'll also be sharing a a table, with the Earth Stewardship Team at the Mission Expo, which is open different times, Saturday to Thursday. So if you're at conference, please come and see us at any of those times. And then finally, if you have questions, we'd ask you to put them in the chat. We will have several opportunities throughout today's presentations for reflection and questions. I will next turn it over to Lori.
Sorry, I needed to unmute. So let me extend my welcome as well to all of you. I assume you can hear me now. Is that correct? Okay, I'm here. I'm seeing some thumbs up. I want to invite us into a time of reflection and meditation. As I've prepared for today, I have been drawn more and more to understand really almost viscerally the impacts of war on the climate crisis, and also to stand as witness with courage to the destabilization of both ecosystems and human lives. So today's meditation, focusing on the war in Ukraine, relies on two sources. One of them is an article from February's Emergence magazine titled "The Fallout: Voices from Ukraine," and a free repository of photos on depositphoto.com's Say No to War site that has been intentionally assembled to make the truth of war visible. So I've placed both of those links in your chat. And as we enter this time of meditation, I invite you to hold these words in your heart. In their welfare resides your welfare. Write it down if you'd like, because as we move through these photos with each one, I would ask you to repeat in your heart, in their welfare resides your welfare. I would ask you to remember how it is that we are all interconnected. In their welfare resides our welfare. Land, animals, animals wild and animals domestic, trees and plants, as well, of course, as humans on both sides of this conflict. We are all connected. In their welfare resides our welfare. Allow your breath to sit with those words, to ring with those words for the next few minutes. Before I began putting this meditation together, I had no idea how beautiful Ukraine had been. In their welfare resides our welfare. Breathing, in their welfare resides our welfare. How will we respond as a community of faith? And offering our thanks to the many photographers who have offered their photos free of charge so that we might all understand and be able to see the truth of war.
Thank you, Lori, for that very poignant meditation. It's now my privilege to introduce the speaker for today, David Anderson. He comes with a Doctor of Ministry degree. Many people will know him because he is the High Priest Quorum President within the Church, within Community of Christ. He is also a retired United States Air Force Colonel, has a master's degree in international public policy from SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies at Hopkins University. One of the topics he'll be talking about is that climate disasters are threat multipliers and increase the danger of global insecurity and social destabilization. With his academic background in international policy, his personal military experience, and his knowledge of NATO, Dave brings a global perspective to this issue as well as the US perspective. In many countries, he has found it isn't just the military, but the entire foreign affairs and defense policy establishments that are aware of climate crises and engaging in the preparations to deal with the resulting instability. So I am very much anticipating his contribution today. I am so glad he found the time to be here with us. I guess I should add, I will be giving a small piece. It was partly to help out and coax him into doing it, to alleviate a bit of the responsibility. I will be doing a piece on Darfur, and that is because I was the creator and editor of the Church's International Human Rights Newsletter, a monthly newsletter. And it just so and that was over 20 years ago, and it just happened to coincide with when the Darfur crisis took hold. And I was looking for some type of longitudinal study so that we could get a better grasp on the longer term implications and how in the world you solve these things. So I just happened to have selected Darfur. I am not an academic expert, but boy, I sure read a lot of books and articles and kept up with all the news. But the main thing is I developed a network of people from Darfur who are out in the diaspora now, Canada, the US, and the UK. And it's really because of their insight, I'm more simply a voice of their stances. And so we'll be doing a short section on that. It's a very serious topic, so I thought I would start with end with just a very light little anecdote. It's a Chinese poem from the Tang Dynasty, which, let's call it around 750s. I didn't look up the actual date, but it's by the poet, I think, Li Bo Ai. And I'm just going to paraphrase it. It goes like this. Title, Mourning My Falling Hairs. At night I go to sleep, and in the morning I see all the hairs that have fallen from my head. Day after day that occurs. And yet, now that they're all gone, it's not so bad. No longer do I have to, and I'll pause if you remember the intricacies of how they had their hairstyles back then. I no longer have to worry about the wraps and the combs and all of that paraphernalia. And best of all, in the hot summer, I get to just put my head back and get someone to pour some cool water over my palate. Now I understand why monks, in trying to feel close to heaven, cut their hair. So, if you wanted to know the real authority of David, that's probably it, and perhaps myself. But think about it. Arthur Oakman, that fits. Danny Belrose. And think of our current president as he has matured over the years. What's happened to his head? So I don't know, there could be something to that. Anyway, without further ado, I want to introduce to you David.
Well, thank you, Rod. Nothing like starting out with a good bald person joke. I am really pleased to be here today. When I was asked to share my thoughts on this important topic, I was really excited. Given my professional experience and academic background outside of my ministry with Community of Christ, I have a passion for international affairs, international public diplomacy and policy, as well as security. I think we would all agree that climate impact on our global security is salient and critical to a community whose enduring principles of sacredness of creation, pursuit of shalom, and our desire to join with God in creating communities of Christ's peace who are called to reconcile and restore. As I look around the Zoom this afternoon or this evening or this morning, wherever you're at in the world, I see many familiar faces, and I want to acknowledge the very deep friendship I have with many of you. And for those who I have not met yet, I look forward to sharing together today, but also perhaps at World Conference. Go ahead and turn on the slides if you would, Rod. Thanks. As our title slide indicates, our topic today is climate impact on global security. As we engage together, I would like our experience to be more of a discussion and not a presentation by me. I know many of you have an expertise, a passion on the topics of climate impact and climate crisis and want to solve and mitigate the issues of climate change. So I want us to engage in a discussion, and I look forward to hearing from you. But before we start, I want to acknowledge two elephants in the room, or two quandaries that lurk deep into the topics of climate change and global security. The first one is defense, security, remains the single largest consumer of hydrocarbons. That's like fuel and gas in the world. And as we know, the use of fossil fuel contributes to climate change. In fact, a major new UN report just released last Monday stated that the Earth is likely to cross a critical threshold for global warming within the next decade. Nations will need to make an immediate and drastic shift away from fossil fuels to prevent the planet from overheating dangerously. And so defense and security will be an important part of that reduction if we're successful. But the problem is how do we lower defense and all of the costs with that when we live in such a dangerous world? The second elephant in the room, or quandary, is what Lori so appropriately and adequately shared about the consequences of war and the use of weaponry, because it is horrific. It's horrible to humanity. It's horrible to our environment, the cost, the terrible loss of life, waste of billions of dollars, the health and mental health consequences, as well as the devastation. And the list goes on and on and on. But do we let another country invade another country and take away its culture and its people and its freedom? Now, I don't have an answer to these two problems, these two elephants in the room, other than I suffer and I lament, but I feel we need to acknowledge them. But on the other hand, I have an intense hope. Wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have war and the problems that are initiated with international instability that require a defense? Now, I have lots of thoughts on the matter, but this isn't the appropriate venue in which to share them. So let's stick to the topic of climate change and global security. Former President Obama, United States, in 2015 summed up our topic very well. He stated, climate change constitutes a serious threat to global security. It is an immediate risk. In the intervening 8 years, this truth rings with clarity and proclaims a clarion call. More and more politicians, security, and military professionals around the world increasingly recognize that climate change needs to be included in defense and security planning. Next slide, please. For our discussion today, I plan to tee up for our discussion 4 different aspects of the topic of climate change and global security. Transitioning between each of these 4 topics, we'll take a time to reflect, to engage in discussion, and to share any observations that we have. First, I want to remind us that climate disasters are threat multipliers. I will quote in this section from various security policy leaders from NATO, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, United States, and 2 international organizations. Second, I will share security priorities of some organizations, including NATO, an organization called the International Military Council on Climate Security. And because of my United States Air Force background, I want to share as an example of what a military service would do within the context of the countries of NATO and the Western democracies, what a military service is doing in regarding to security policy with the climate crisis. So in this case, I'm going to specifically hone in on what the United States Air Force is doing. Third, I want to share some real-world case studies of the impact climate change has on regional conflict. There are many examples and hotspots to choose from, including with our own countries. But for the purpose of this discussion, I have chosen 4: the Balkans, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Rod Downing has graciously agreed to talk about the climate as a force multiplier of the genocidal conflict in Darfur. And fourth, and in conclusion, we want to have a discussion why this topic is so important to us. We will ask the questions, so what and what now? Next slide, please. As we continue to talk about climate impacts, how it impacts global security, I want to emphasize emphatically that climate change and disasters are force multipliers. In other words, climate change, climate disasters, climate crises all amplify existing problems in our world. And as stated on this slide, a force multiplier intensifies existing tensions over resource scarcity or sparks regional destabilization and conflicts. It also can increase the danger of global insecurity in general. And as I mentioned in our overview slide, we will discuss a couple of examples in the Balkans and Africa. Next slide, please. This is a quote from the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He spoke these words standing alongside Prime Minister Justin Trudeau from a Canadian Forces Air Base in Cold Lake. And I'll let you read the words. So what words or phrases stand out to you? Either just unmute, share them, or just put it in the chat. What words there in that phrase by the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, what is he saying there to you? Okay, we have Susan saying, would someone mind reading those out?
It's more accessible for military action. That's scary. More accessible for economic and military activity. Economic, deep sea explorations, etc. make me shudder. Important and accessible. Okay, a lot of repetition there.
Okay.
He's noting the tactical importance of the area, not addressing the ecological loss.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. But I do want to say that in this same discussion that Secretary Jens Stoltenberg had with Justin Trudeau at this Canadian Forces Base, he said in this press conference that the both leaders were highlighting the need to recognize the rapidly changing security threats in the high Arctic. Melting sea ice and warming temperatures in the Arctic will fundamentally shift the security challenges facing NATO allies, including specifically Canada, Iceland, Norway, and the United States in the region as Russia and China forge deeper strategic ties. So we're getting into a huge competition between superpowers as the Arctic area begins to melt, seaways become more accessible, and there's competition for resources. Next slide, please. This quote is from the British Ministry of Defense Climate Change and Sustainability Strategic Approach. It's in a section called Future Environments Require Our Armed Forces to Anticipate Change. I'm going to give you some time to read it. And then I'm going to ask the same question. What words or phrases stand out to you? And then let's just briefly put them in the chat. Again, if you want, just what words or phrases stand out, just briefly put them in the chat, and then if someone would read just a few of them, and we'll move on.
Complex and hard to predict. Need for resilience.
Okay.
It's only just beginning. Lest us older folks think we're immune or our children are going to escape. Defend its citizens from climate change or from other armed forces. Question.
Okay. Okay, so in addition to this quote in this section of the strategic approach, the review lead in the defense paper, his name is Lieutenant General Richard Nugent, writes, "The character of warfare is changing fast, so is the climate. Both issues are changing the way our military fight, live, and train in unfamiliar ways. Linking these issues together They both demand that we adapt to the new circumstances that we face and take transformative action now. We need to change mindsets and the way we operate in peace, in war, and in persistent competition. Now, a firmly defense problem, climate change is a significant challenge. Rather sobering, is it not? Next slide, please. This is a quote from the National Security Strategy of 2023. It's prepared by the national security establishment, including diplomats, national security policymakers, military and intelligence officers. This strategy is a document prepared periodically by the executive branch of the United States that lists national security concerns and how the administration plans to deal with them. Again, I'll give you some time to read it and then ask you what words or phrases are beginning to emerge for you. What's standing out to you?
Michael says it could be an opportunity to promote the oneness of humanity for working together on global problems.
Okay.
Immediate global action. And Andrew says 1.5 degrees has already blown.
Okay.
How does the fact that it is the military who is offering these recognitions create opportunity to reach some who don't want to believe this is even real? And the phrase extreme heat and weather.
Okay, good. What I see is existential challenge. I see in danger people around the world, catastrophic biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. This is a quote from a climate risk analysis by the Department of Defense. The previous was the National Security Strategy written by civilians, the national security policy. Now we're moving into a kind of a military Department of Defense response. And this is a climate risk analysis that it's developed, the Department of Defense has developed as a result of the National Security Strategy. I'm going to let you take some time to read this quote and then we'll talk about it. What words stand out?
The focus of the armed forces needs to change from defense to a combination of forces to care for the earth. Existential challenge of our lifetime that speaks to me of its supreme importance. The words exacerbating existing risks, significant implications, unpredictable, increasing risks. And the observation that the rich will secure their futures, but the poor will be the first to suffer and suffer longer.
Okay, good, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a quote from the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, which is an Australian policy think tank on climate consisting of a group of ex-military members and experienced practitioners of national and international security who recognize that climate change is a fundamental threat to all Australians. This quote expresses our thoughts on how climate change impacts global security. Again, I'll give you some time to read it and then put in the chats any observations or any keywords that come to mind.
Global inaction. as devastating as nuclear war. Global inaction is the greatest threat to the security of the people.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a quote from a former Canadian Chief of Defense, General Jonathan Vance, when he was talking about the burdens of women and men in uniform due to climate change. Again, I invite you to read it silently, and then I'll ask the question, what key words or phrases stand out to you? Okay, what words or phrases stand out to you here? Or what thoughts come to mind?
Kathy suggests that the Department of Defense could become defense of the planet.
Okay.
It's exhausting and costly. The effects of on the families of the military. Climate change is having a greater impact on defense than ever before. Too many tasks, so let's prioritize climate. Sacrifice required. The military will be stretched thin. The armed forces are our last resort, international rescue. Called out in thousands to deal with climate.
Okay, thank you. Now, General Vance, when he was sharing this quote, he also added other thoughts. And he said that Canada's armed forces are being pushed to the limit, responding to an increasing number of climate-related events such as floods and fires. He said that he needed more men and women to handle these crises, and his soldiers needed more training to deal with the natural disasters and fires and floods. Next slide, please. This quote comes from General Tom Mittendorp. He was a former Chief of Defense for the Netherlands, and he's retired. He's currently chair of the International Military Council, which is a military council of climate change and security, which is an organization consisting of a council of senior military and security experts from both the governmental sector and non-governmental sector, committed to an opening exchange of ideas on the military and security dimensions of climate change. And we'll be talking about this organization when we talk about policies. But I'm going to give you some time to read this, and then what words or phrases stand out to you.
The next 2 decades. It could be catastrophic soon. The security community has a responsibility to prevent these threats. They are key. It's not just environmentalists. More American military leaders need to speak out. Climate proofing international security at all levels.
Okay, good. Go to the next slide, please. Now, I know we've had an opportunity to reflect and observe on each of these phrases and quotes and discuss a little bit and listen, but I want to have just a further reflection and discussion, questions or any observations that you have to kind of summarize this section. What's coming to mind as you listen to the commonality of these expressions of these various leaders and military leaders in organizations? What's coming kind of bubbling up so far?
I'm looking for people to raise their hand if they want to speak or use the symbol. Anyone?
What does it mean to climate-proof international security?
Okay, we're going to have a chance to talk about that when we get into the security priority and security policies, but that's a very good question, one that many countries feel very strongly about climate proofing. Yes, that's a good question.
Thank you, David.
How are countries working together on this issue is one question that's posed.
Okay, very good question. Looks like, Sherry, we're going to be talking about security priorities. For example, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and others, including this specifically the United States Air Force, how it's falling in line with certain aspects of climate proofing, et cetera. So very good question that we'll be talking about shortly. What's bubbling up as far as the quotes and items that are being changed? Yes, what's next?
Lee has raised his hand.
Thank you. I'm sorry I don't have a camera today. I'm a veteran and I am a longtime employee with the Veterans Administration. So it really changed my impression of things to see how military commanders are considering the climate crisis. For me, I think I was probably most touched by thinking, oh no, we'll have another generation of service members coming into care at the VA administration. And I always feel that we as a country never pay attention to the costs of war and how we end up having to deal and try to manage the consequences of war when our own people come home. So I'm thinking 20 more years, 40 more years, 60 more years of service members who are traumatized and disconnected from their families and disabled. That was not something that I had in my own my sphere of understanding about what the climate crisis was to us.
Okay. Okay, we'll have an opportunity to reflect further. Oh, there's another question there before I move on.
Kathy has a question or comment. You're muted, Kathy.
Sorry. I have a question in the chat, and I'm looking at this from a U.S. perspective because I'm happen to be a U.S. citizen. So when about half of the U.S. population are climate change deniers, and one of our two major political parties scoffs at the existence of climate change, how can we assume that military leaders who probably represent proportionately what our own population believes, how can we believe military leaders could unite around preparations for it?
Okay, I think that's a good question, Kathy, and we'll get into the security priorities of, let's say, NATO, of the United States Air Force, and we'll bring that into a discussion at the end of that. Let's queue up that question. It's a very good question because the National Security Strategy is a civilian organization or a civilian document, let's say in the U.S. context, or NATO is a document that 30 countries have agreed upon, of which the United States is one of them. And it's done by consensus. So all of these 30 countries have agreed that this is the policy, the direction and understanding of global security and crisis, and that it all flows downhill. So that's a good question, one that we'll answer or we'll have a discussion on the other end. Oh, good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's go back to the presentation, and we'll have lots of opportunity to talk. If you have a question, just don't hesitate to put it in the chat, and you can even interrupt me if we need to as we go along, because I want this to be a discussion. Okay, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I should be familiar to you. It consists of 30 countries, which is Canada, of which I think all of the countries in the Zoom all represented in NATO. It's a treaty organization, a national defense multilateral organization. All countries and all decisions are made by consensus. So it's not voting and then some don't participate. It's either you agree to it or you can live with it. But any decision that NATO makes, it has to be agreed by all 30. And if you're following the news, Sweden and Finland wanted to join NATO now and are seeking membership. Turkey has resisted and not agreed to Sweden's yet because of some issues with the Kurds. But anyway, so all of this climate change and security action plan are all supported by all 30 countries. They've agreed to it. Now, one of my roles at NATO headquarters in Brussels was sitting on committees representing the United States. And we would draft a document, let's say on peacekeeping, with which I was involved with. And if the Icelanders and the Italians disagreed about a word in that document, we had to work out what word to use. Okay, so it's a very difficult, painstaking method of consensus building, but it's one that's been very successful. But anyway, there is a NATO security policy called the NATO Climate Change and Security Action Plan. In this action plan, it says very significantly that the planet's changing climate has a significant effect on national defense missions, plans, and military installations. As such, many militaries around the world are elevating climate change as national security priorities, integrating climate considerations into policies, strategies, and partner engagements. And so, as such, NATO, comprising these 30 nations, has developed a security action plan. And I want to just briefly go over it. In this action plan, next slide, please. NATO defines 3 areas. The first one is impact of climate change on security. So it states very specifically that climate change is one of the defining challenges of our time. They say very specifically, it is a threat multiplier that impacts allied security, both in the Euro-Atlantic area and the alliance's broader neighborhood. Climate change also makes it harder for militaries to carry out their tasks. Greater temperature extremes, sea level rise, rapid changes in precipitation patterns, and increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events test the resilience of military installations and critical infrastructure. They impair the effectiveness of capabilities and create even harder and more harsher conditions for military operations and missions. They also say very specifically that the effects of climate change shape our geopolitical environment and may influence state behavior. For example, thawing permafrost, desertification, and opening up of new shipping lanes are factors that can contribute to the increased instability and geostrategic competition. When I was at the NATO Defense College in Rome, Italy, one of the very important aspects we had was talking about national security concerns of all of the NATO countries. And we traveled around all of Europe, North America, and Italy. And one of the concerns of the Norwegians, the Icelanders, the Canadians, and the Americans was the Arctic, the high north that we've talked about, the quote, remember at the beginning? And one of the issues was the Russians were building and enhancing and modernizing a Navy base along the Koala Peninsula, which is along the Arctic. And that was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And as Arctic snow and the shipping lanes open up, this competition is occurring within the North as the Russians are building stronger and stronger modernization and beginning to take access. And all of the area along the Arctic is kind of unclaimed. And so there's a competition for resources. And this is causing increased stability to the north, particularly with the idea of the Russian and the Chinese becoming closer and closer to working together. So this is very specifically, again, a destabilization of issues. And then it says, the implications of climate change include drought, soil erosion, marine environmental degradation, lead to famine and floods, and loss of land and livelihood. And we're all aware of that. And then the NATO document, of which all 30 countries agree to, very specifically says that these famines, floods, loss of land and livelihood have a disproportionate impact on women and girls, as well as on poor, vulnerable, or marginalized populations, as well as potentially exacerbate state fragility, fuel conflicts, and lead to displacement, migration, human mobility, and creating conditions that can be exploited by state and non-state actors that threaten or challenge the alliance or world peace. Rather sobering, is it not? Next slide, please. So in this climate action plan, NATO places security issues in context regarding climate change. It tries to address the environmental challenges in ways, and it's been doing it for over a half century, but mostly through science and research. So now they're trying to work with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They're signatories to the Paris Agreement, and NATO allies, including the United States, Canada, Australia, not Australia, but the United Kingdom, have recognized the need for an effective and progressive response to the urgent threat of climate change and subscribe to the goal of limiting global warming. So NATO allies have stepped up their ambition and are taking concrete action at national level and through coordinated efforts in the United Nations and the European Union context, where applicable, to realize a transition towards durable sustainability. And then next slide, please. So then the third aspect of this NATO security plan regarding climate crisis is planning for the future. So this action plan sets out a framework for delivering NATO's agenda on the climate change to contribute to NATO's three core tasks, which are to guarantee the security of the alliance through monitoring visibility of dealing with climate. First, it is to help increase allied awareness. Second, it is to adapt to climate change by building assessments, incorporate climate change considerations into its work on resilience, civilian preparedness, defense planning, capability delivery, assets and installations that are trying to adapt to change. Third, this action plan tries to contribute to the mitigation of climate change. The alliance will develop a NATO mapping and analytical methodology of greenhouse gas emissions from military activities and installations. So they take the data, energy demand and consumption in the military, and try to inform investment decisions, try to develop sustainable technology to allow to mitigate this climate crisis. And fourth, the NATO action plan tries to enhance outreach to partner countries all over the world, as well as international and regional organizations that are active on climate change and security, including the UN and the European Union, as well as the countries all over the world, to increase dialogue with civil society, academia, and industry on climate change and security issues. But the bottom line regarding NATO is that this action plan is a sobering assessment. It was released in 2022 that NATO recognizes climate change as an overarching challenge of our time and will immeasurably increase the risks to security and worsen as the world warms further. It calls for a fundamental transformation of NATO's approach, that's all 30 countries, to defense and security, and sets NATO, all 30 countries, including soon to be Finland and hopefully Sweden, as a leading international organization in understanding and adapting to climate change. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, to better understand the climate impact on security and how military organizations are trying to work through climate crisis and impact on security, I've decided to choose a military service within NATO, which happens to be United States. And because I'm a former Air Force officer and a retired colonel, I chose the Air Force because I know most about that. But I can guarantee you that every military service, when in each of the 30 countries, whether it's Army, a Navy, or Air Force, or Coast Guard, is trying to take NATO security policy, develop the national security policy from the US perspective, trying to work through the Department of Defense, and developing an action plan for that military service. So this is just a brief overview of what the United States Air Force Security Action Plan is regarding climate. The highest ranking civilian, who is the Secretary of the Air Force, a political appointee by the name of Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, writes, and I quote, he writes in this action plan and directs the Air Force to develop and follow this action plan. He says, extreme weather and environmental conditions are already imposing high costs on the Air Force installations and operational missions, while simultaneously posing new risks to our ability to train and operate effectively. In recent years, we have seen Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida and many of its fighter aircraft devastated by Hurricane Michael. We have seen a third of Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, flooded as the Missouri River overwhelmed levees, as well as multiple installations, Air Force installations across the United States threatened by advancing wildfires. He says, extreme heat and humidity can also challenge our deployed forces' operational readiness. And he writes, environmental changes in the Arctic, the high north, have led to increased adversary access and activity in the region. He states further, every airman, everyone in the Air Force has a role in helping the department or the Air Force succeed in adapting to and overcoming the effects of climate change to ensure success across the globe. This climate action plan is your roadmap. He's writing to the airmen, to everyone in the Air Force, to combat climate change. It is your call to action. Next slide, please. The Air Force Action Plan highlights 3 priorities. The first one is, like an operational military organization would be, it needs to maintain air and space dominance in the face of climate risks. So maintaining operational readiness, access to locations globally to be able to execute its mission when called on, it needs to keep pace with the threats and the climate. That's priority number 1. Another priority is, next slide, please, is to make climate-informed decisions. It is to institute enduring advantages while combating the effects of climate change. In the document, it says, the Air Force must fundamentally shift the way the Air Force thinks, prepares, and acts. As we execute the Air Force's priorities through all the planning documents, all of our actions, across even our acquisitions, we must be deliberate to include climate risks and security implications. How we develop our strategic plans, requirements, wargaming are all foundational, but they must be seamlessly integrated into climate and operational considerations through all of the process and plans and decisions to remain a resilient and responsible force for today, for our allies, and into the future. Next slide, please. Another priority is to optimize energy use and pursue alternative energy sources. The Air Force aims to reduce the fossil fuel demand of current and future weapon systems to enhance the ability to operate in contested environments, increase readiness, reduce logistics tail, and lower greenhouse gas emissions. The Air Force is pursuing alternative energy sources, including piloting projects that produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions and assess their viabilities to support installation energy efficiencies enterprise-wide. Now, I can guarantee you that every Air Force base, every base commander around the world is aware of this security priority for climate crisis. And through their chain of command, they are trying to comply with this action plan in very specific operational ways to help maintain capability, to make sure that all decisions have understanding of climate informed and how to reduce the climate crisis, and to optimize energy use and pursue alternative energy sources. So it's all aspects from acquisitions to intelligence, to base, to flying, to purchasing, to acquisitions. So that's the Air Force. So let's move on to the next organization I want to talk about, security plans. And that is an organization called the International Military Council on Climate and Security. As I mentioned, this is a group, international organization that's comprising of ex-military, senior military, and civilians who understand the military and climate crisis, and they're providing action plans and policies and ideas for militaries, civilian organizations, national security organizations, etc. So they have written a report. This is the report on the left. It's written from the vantage point of international military and security experts, providing a global overview of security risks of a changing climate and opportunities for addressing them. And you will hear as I go along some commonalities of what I've said previously. Next slide, please. In this document, they talk about risks and opportunities. These are the risks that they see that threaten global security under current circumstances. They talk about water insecurity, a global security risk. The climate change exacerbated water insecurity is already a driver of instability, and says, according to 93% of the climate security and military experts surveyed for this report, this water insecurity poses a significant or higher risk to global security and will do so by 2030. The second key risk is climate mitigation, adaptation, resilient efforts are increasingly urgent to avert a significant security consequence of climate change. And the third risk is that there are some factors hampering cooperation that this expert group on International Military Council says. It says that rising authoritarianism, a sharpened global competition, and national agendas are hampering the needed cooperation for nations to address security risks of the climate change. Okay, so those are the key risks. Let's go to the next slide, please. We'll talk about some of the key opportunities. The working group talked about various opportunities. The first one is security and military institutions should demonstrate leadership on climate security risks and resilience, and encourage governments to advance comprehensive emissions reductions and adaptation investments to avoid those security disruptions. Military organizations can also lead by example through taking advantage of significant opportunities to adopt lower carbon energy sources and make progress on other greenhouse gases beyond carbon dioxide. The second key opportunity is climate proofing development assistance. This is where countries are given assistance through funding, helping vulnerable nations, which are likely hotspots of instability and conflict, as well as climate proofing other policies to give priority for conflict prevention. Assistance should be aimed at climate resilience challenges, water insecurity, food scarcity, and disaster preparedness. And their third opportunity is that they should integrate climate knowledge and training into institutional frameworks like NATO, like cooperation between countries in East Asia, and the knowledge and understanding of climate change threats and permeates organizational cultures. So those are the three institutions: NATO, the Air Force, and this World Climate Security Report written by the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Next slide, please. So let's just take a few minutes here to have a little bit of reflection on what I've said, as far as anything that's come to mind, any concerns, any observations. Just have a moment of discussion.
There have been a number of comments in the chat, which I guess I'd try to summarize as either we are working to find ways to be more energy efficient and carbon free in the way that we wage war, but the opportunity for how to, in fact, avoid war through international cooperation is the other side of the coin on these issues.
Yeah, good point. It's like the elephants in the room, isn't it?
Yeah. There's a question of, is there any dialogue between the US, China, Russia, and Europe, and so on? In other words, this conflict that we have now that has NATO on one side and apparently Russia and China on the other, is there any conversation about bridging that gap around climate issues?
I'm sure there is. I'm not aware of specifics, although, it's hard to cooperate when you're showing adversity and, contributing to the issues in Ukraine on both sides, and then the competition in China with lots of issues from the Spratly Islands and the access to the South China Sea and all the issues of I know it's on the agenda, and the United Nations also has a cooperative agreement on climate. So them being part of the Security Council, as well as being members of the United Nations, there is dialogue, but not at the same degree as, let's say, NATO and the expression of trying to gather together, what the global implications are for security.
Joan says, I like the concept of military leaders deciding to advise governments, politicians, to take climate risks and actions more seriously. In other words, at least that voice from the military that says this is really serious business.
And it's not just the military, it's, being in NATO and being democratic countries, the people who are responsible for the militaries are the civilians. So it's the national security establishment, including military and civilians, that are working together, including the State Department, that are trying to engage this together. So it's both military and it's national security civilians working together to help mitigate this climate change, and knowing that this climate crisis is exacerbating the global insecurity that we're facing.
I don't see other hands raised.
Okay.
So let's perhaps move to the.
Okay. So let's go to the case studies. I think we're on a good track here. So let's bring up the presentation and talk briefly on the case studies, because these are important. Okay, as I mentioned at the outset, there are literally hundreds of case studies around the world that show that the climate crisis, that the climate issues have a significant threat multiplier on security and establishment, insecurity, and the destabilization of various aspects. And we're going to have an opportunity to talk about that a little bit, because I think you can all think of some examples, but I've chosen just a few. And the first one I want to talk about is the Balkans. Now, in 1997 to 2001, I was an operations policy advisor at NATO, working for the ambassador, the US ambassador, a civilian, working in NATO as a policy advisor, working peacekeeping issues in the Balkans, in Bosnia and Kosovo. And at the time, there was a genocide going on, and NATO was involved to separate in peacekeeping, trying to keep the parties apart, trying to seek a solution, but maintaining this separation. And Bosnia and the Balkans was a hotbed of activity. There was terrible genocide going on between this interethnic strife of religious aspects of the history of the Ottoman Empire, Christianity, Eastern Orthodox. It was a terrible hotbed of activity where literally millions of people have died, billions of dollars of military aid, strife, killing, weapons. It was extremely challenging for NATO and for those who are living in the Balkans. So now 20 years later, the Balkans is still an ethnically diverse geographic area. It's a region that lives in the south, that lies on the southeastern edge of the European continent. It has Balkan countries such as the former Yugoslavia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and the former Republic of Macedonia. You've heard of those countries before, but there still remains this rich, diverse, ethnic area that's still there. And this global crisis, the droughts, pose a large threat to the region's stability and prosperity. So the Balkans, because of its location and because of the climate change, face some of the most severe climate risks compared with the rest of Europe. These climate risks have a diversity of security impacts. For example, climate change, by placing pressure on the region's resources, risks exacerbating existing ethno-political fault lines that have been there for the last 20 years, that occurred when I was there at NATO. It opens the door to the potential resurgence of conflict or political instability in the process. So this intensifying climate change impacts the heat waves, the tropical storms that highlight these post-conflict tensions. They threaten Europe's broader climate goals and increase the Balkan susceptibility to influence from autocratic governments such as Russia and China. Additionally, in the Balkans, because of its location and its issues, you have kind of a competition and climate-induced migration flows from the Middle East and Africa through the region that are exploited by far-right extremists. And so this ongoing conflict in neighboring Ukraine only further highlights these concerns. So Bosnia, or this Balkans, is a perfect example of the drought, the heat, and causing and increasing the capacity of the danger and the conflict of this area. So the next case study I want to talk about is Mali. Now, Mali is a good example where climate-driven conflict is not always a straightforward scramble for diminishing resources, be they water, food, and arable land. So in a region in central Mali, for example, the situation was that the government and its partners drilled new wells to ease the plight of nomads, making arid lands and areas more livable. Sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? Bringing water to a part of the area to drill new wells to bring water to the plight of nomads. But what it did is it inadvertently attracted farmers who over time laid claim to the land around the wells, originally dug for the herders' benefit. So the government officials and traditional authorities failed to regulate the resulting land use issues fairly or effectively, and relations between the farmers and the herders, already frayed, turned violent. So another example of how climate change is a multiplier. So let's move on to the next one, Burkina Faso. So this is another similar conflict played out between settled and nomadic populations when development projects boosted rice production. So non-native farmers moved to a newly bountiful area, stirring crisis and tensions with an indigenous population, mainly nomadic herders. So in both of the situations of Mali and Burkina Faso, conflict was not a result of competition over dwindling resources. It was a competition, and groups were fighting over the spoils of human response to climate change. So some herders and some people felt neglected and marginalized in both cases by the centralized authorities. They turned to the jihadi and self-defense groups for protection, and violence ensued. So violence was triggered not by diminishing resources, but rather by newfound and poorly regulated resource abundance. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about Darfur, and then I'll take, I guess, whatever time we have to kind of sum it up with so what and what now.
Yes, thanks, Dave. Just give me a second. That should do it. Hopefully everybody's seeing a brown screen at the moment. If you aren't, put something in the chat because I can't see anybody at this point.
It says foundational concepts, and then the climate change and threat multipliers, example Darfur.
Right, yes, yeah. I'm going to skip over quickly on this. His examples of Mali and Burkina Faso have some similar aspects. With regard to Darfur, the above images are the ones you probably think of. Those go back to 2003, 2004. You might think that since sort of 2008 or 9, that's when it sort of left the media, that this is being resolved. You may have heard that the President Bashir was in fact ousted and a new government put in, and my gosh, wouldn't that be marvelous? And things changed. But it was simply like changing the chairs on the Titanic. The structures remained the same. The people in the IDP and refugee camps are still there. The villages have been either burned down or now occupied by foreigners. And so this is an ongoing problem that just simply isn't in the news. But one of the tensions already alluded to some extent is the typical one of herders versus farmers. In behind that is the much longer legacy of an inherited Black versus Arab Muslim tension, and as well the inherited colonial legacy. What I intended to do with this section is show that even though there could be a fairly obvious sounding threat multiplier, a tension that gets exacerbated, and that is the case, that these last two bullet points show that no, there's a lot deeper tensions underlying that. And I don't even get into all of these aspects that also play into this singular area and its tragedy. Now, I am not going to do the whole 10 minutes, so I'm going to skip over everything. Maybe I'll do a little extra at some point. The area on that's circled on your left is Darfur. It's the size of Texas. The little circle in the middle is Khartoum. That's where the power is. That's the capital. That's where that inherited colonial legacy had the English leave 3 tribes in power, and they remain in power today, even though they've changed to some extent. And they had a common disdain, maybe too strong a word, maybe too weak a word, for the Black Muslims as opposed to who they consider themselves being the Arab Muslims. But that played a very strong role in this. And as you will note, has nothing to do with climate change. But it's one of those tensions that is there. Now, I'm going to hope that you can see my cursor going up and down this circle.
You can.
Good. This is where the herders would take their camels generally, but also cattle, up north. The camels, there happens to be a particular spring plant that they can eat just gobs and gobs of it, and they don't even have to drink water. It is so rich in nutrients. So they just love this stuff. And then they will bring them back down at a later time, depending on the climate. So this goes through a bunch of farming areas. You can think of it as a checkerboard, and you got to sort of work your way down that checkerboard. And here's where the threat multiplier comes in, is the as the desert tended to move in 1 mile per year, and the rainfall dropping about 15 to 30%, that squeezed this whole area. The farms became less fertile. They started to put up fences because, darn it, all those camels coming through would now eat some of or destroy some of the valuable produce. Whereas one of my points is, for centuries before that, this same pattern occurred. The camels going up and down, the cattle going up and down, the farmers staying in the middle. It could be a celebration. The camels would come in, or the pastoralists would bring the camels in. They'd have a feast. The camels would take the produce of the farmers to market. Win-win situation. Now, sometimes 300 cattle would go missing, and we would have a local conflict. But it was a local conflict. They had local conflict mechanisms to deal with it, and it would move on. So for centuries, that was a normal pattern, but no longer. That pattern has been squeezed. The tensions have arisen, conflicts break out, people get killed, and so on. Completely separate from that. Now, that is the threat multiplier, but completely separate from that are the people in Khartoum who saw this and said, oh, these are master manipulators. And so they took that situation. They took one of the heads of the camel herders and put them in charge of what we became known as the Janjaweed, now called the RSF, Rapid Support Forces. And then that's when all the villages started to burn. So you had this natural threat multiplier that then a completely separate party, the central government, who should be looking after everybody, but in fact didn't like these people, so left them marginalized, left the whole marginal, 3 other areas marginalized too, made use of this threat multiplier and basically tried to ethnically cleanse, and in fact was later labeled a genocide. Interestingly enough, the ICC, International Criminal Court, you may have noticed that President Bashir was indicted on all 3 charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. But the ICC has no teeth to go and get him. And so he remains in Sudan. He remained president until he got in trouble and was put in jail. And there is now a new leadership. But like I say, the structure remains exactly the same because England put in those 3 tribes and they still have the same outlook. And so it goes. So there is a lot of other things going on. I'm going to leave most of it at that single example to show that even what sounds like a simple threat multiplier of cattle, of farmers versus herders can become a threat multiplier, and they can be at each other's throat. That outside people, like the government of Sudan, can then even further manipulate them and turn it into genocidal dynamics, which is what happened in this case. Now, where does it sit right now? 2023, the Army head, Lieutenant General Al-Burhan, and the next in command to the Janjaweed, now the RSF, his nickname is Hamedi, I'll leave it at that. They're now in charge of Sudan. And the big question is, how long can 2 people rule a country before they are at each other's throat? So Darfur could collapse entirely. If not, one or the other of these men may maintain control. It is possible another coup may take place. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but in amongst all of that, the climate continues to get worse. There is still armed conflict in Darfur, and it spreads to other areas. And in my shortened version, I'm just going to go through these, and I think leave all of the rest of this. The only other thing I will add, so in the conclusions, climate change is a source of the conflict. As the source of a conflict, no, but it was definitely a factor. Whoops, sorry, I'm on the wrong screen. The source of conflict, no, but definitely a factor. Here are the sources, primarily Khartoum versus Darfur and its peripherals, the meddling of other countries that we haven't gotten into, others in a desire for power. We'll see what happens. But what I wanted to do is quickly to the solutions. First of all, let's address climate change. There's your ultimate solution. But in terms of the international community, one of the things is international development. Difficult when there are warring states, almost impossible, but in fact, there is progress being made, even in this condition. I would say there are 3 main things: good governance, which is of course easy to say, but that is the chief problem, is that you have a central government that doesn't care about its peripheries. Empowering girls and women has long been recognized as an international development strategy that is very effective. Now, it will have limits at the moment, but at least it prepares the basic citizenry to someday have their voice heard and have their place. And finally, you need an inclusive, enticing vision. And that is utterly lacking in Sudan. It could be a wonderful win-win gateway amongst Africa and Europe and the Arab world and others, but nobody sees it that way. And until you get that enticing vision, they will remain at each other's throats. And I'll simply have to leave it at there. Like I say, I'll maybe make a fuller version of it at some other time. So at this point, I will, if I can get my cursor to do its magic, we will move back to the PowerPoint for Dave. And Dave, I'll let you take it from there.
I think we're running out of time. I just want to make one comment and then I'll turn it over. Can I, do I have time to make one comment?
Go ahead.
Okay, if you go ahead and take off the slides. Yeah, there's a whole lot more to talk about, but unfortunately we're out of time. I do want to talk about case studies. There's lots of examples of case studies. And in the US context, if you take a look at the Colorado River Basin, where these states are competing for water, and it's reported in the latest news that Wall Street Journal and companies are buying up the land around the Colorado River for the water rights. And it's causing tension with farmers and the herders. So even in a US context, and I'm sure there's ones in every country that have represented, that there are global tensions. Now, they're not bubbling up to be international, but they're there. So that's all I have. Sorry, I ran out of overtime.
Joan, I think it's to you now.
Thanks, David. And I want to thank you so much. It's been just a huge amount of information that we're so grateful for. I'm going to have to go back and watch the recording 3 times to absorb it all, but it's been wonderful. And so I'm really thankful that you agreed to spend this time with us. Go ahead and continue to send us in your questions as we continue to interact with David and continue to develop activities around this topic. We had some other things planned, but we're out of time. And so I just want to thank everyone who stayed with us, especially when we go longer, and remind you to look for us at World Conference, Tuesday and Thursday lunch and learns. Tuesday, the Youth Stewardship team has graciously given us some time in their lunch and learn, which we really appreciate. And we'll be sharing a table at the Mission Expo. So thank you all.